You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer. Today we're going to be talking about arguments for and against the existence of God. We think these arguments matter, and we want to think hard about them. After all, we think that Christianity is true, but if God doesn't exist, well, then it's not. Our welcome guest is Patrick Flynn. He's the author of the new book, The Best Argument for God. Comes to us this month, from Sophia Institute Press. Patrick's a writer and a speaker. He lives in Wisconsin with his wife, 5 children, and a Saint Bernard. Now, this is an aside, but the word out is that in his heart of hearts, he'd prefer to have an Irish wolfhound. We'll discuss that later. More centrally, he's the host of Philosophy for the People. As always, we begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful, by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Pat, let me start with this question. How is it, good sir, that Athens can't have anything to do with Jerusalem? And wasn't there once upon a time, in real time, a fellow named Justin Martyr? And would he be an ally for you in your response?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jim, and thanks everyone for having me on the program. So the idea, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? If I remember right, that sort of started as an objection, didn't it? Trace back to Tertullian, right? And he essentially wanted to say, hey, what does the God of the pagans, right, or the God of the philosophers have to do with the God of the Bible? It's my understanding of this objection. They seem, at least on the face, pretty radically different or distinct, or just not really sure what exactly they have in common. But
you get echoes of that in Pascal, right?
Yeah, you get it today, right? I mean, there's
right.
Many. They're sometimes called neoclassical theists or theistic personalists who argue that the God of classical theism, the conception of God that St. Thomas Aquinas has defended, the God that I would suggest is that Catholics are dogmatically committed to, is not compatible with the God of the Bible. So this is not an objection that has gone away. It's still very much into contemporary literature. But it goes something like this, right? That, hey, well, I guess the response goes something like this, is that this philosophical project of God, of hunting for the sort of ultimate ground of intelligibility of the universe that is supposed to explain a whole suite of broad features of reality, specifically the nature of existence, of contingent existence, right? That hunt for ultimate explanation terminates in something that at first impression seems pretty spooky, right? This reality that is utterly transcendent, it's eternal, it's immutable, it's omnipotent, it's omniscient, it's perfectly good. And some of those qualities, it might seem, don't initially fit extremely well with how we see God portrayed in the Bible as a being of great personal intimacy, of being responsive to people and their prayers, of being very much involved in our lives and the sort of governance of the universe. Now, of course, I think all these things can be made compatible, and there's many great Catholic philosophers out there who've done work on that. I've done and I highlighted, I think, some of the general solutions to that presumed tension in my own book. But generally, if we go...
Pat, a quick interjection.
Sure.
And this happened last time around as well, and I want to catch it early if I can. There's a little bit of feedback coming through.
Yeah, I'm hearing that. I was wondering if that's on my end or... Well, now it's gone. Let's see here. Okay. Sometimes it helps if everyone who isn't talking is just muted, and then we unmute once we speak. It sounds okay now, but if it keeps up, then we'll try and issue a correction. Does it sound like I'm actually talking through my mic or my computer? Because sometimes it picks up the wrong. No, okay, my settings are right. Okay, let me try and continue that line of thought. So Justin Martyr, anyways, long story short, Justin Martyr thought that all this sort of pagan or Greek philosophy could set the philosophical stage for revelation, sort of preempted revelation, and helps to affirm many of the core aspects of the Christian religion when properly contextualized and properly understood. So thinkers like Justin Martyr thought that there was actually great harmony between reason and revelation, right? That through good, consistent philosophical reflection about the nature of fundamental reality, we see really a bridge to Christian revelation, not some insurmountable divide. So that's the general thrust. I will say that I'm very much on board with that because that sort of mirrors my personal experience. You know, for many years, I would have considered myself a naturalist, not a religious person at all. And it was actually through metaphysics, philosophy of nature, and natural theology that I came to see, I think, a really strong case for classical theism. And then once classical theism seemed like the right worldview to me, that sort of opened my eyes to the possibility of religion. And then from there, I saw this great compatibility within the Catholic tradition of natural theology and revealed theology. So it was really through this sort of approach of Justin Martyr that philosophy set the stage or preempted me or provided a path for me to take seriously the claims of revelation. And I never found any serious insurmountable conflict between the two. In fact, I think that they fit really nicely together.
All right. Now, one of our members, Mario Ramos-Reyes, is a crypto-existentialist.
Awesome.
And he thinks that I'm a crypto-rationalist. And the only thing that unites us is that we're both opposed to cryptocurrency. But at any rate, Mario, you want to take the next question?
Well, all the things that you are telling me, I already knew.
What?
Let me give you a brief intro. So, your language, the mention you do to Tertullian and all these people, Athens, Jerusalem. So, I understand what you're talking about because I have a memory. I have a, let's call it narrative, like the postmodern like to say. I have in myself this historical data, if you will. So I can figure it out what you're talking about. But my concern today is that most of the most people, not to mention students, not even know what Tertullian was, Greek thought was, Greek philosophy is, Middle Ages. They think that that's a legend, and so on and so forth. Now, you may think that if you go to a grad program in philosophy or undergrad program in philosophy, you're going to learn all of that. I think you're wrong. Generally, what you study there is a little bit of Plato, Aristotle, and then jump into modernity. And so the picture that you get there is not a picture of classical theism. It's a different picture. Let me finish with that and then a question. I have a good student of mine who is a lawyer. I'm a lawyer too.
Oh!
Who went to one of the best universities in Britain to study philosophy of law. One of the third classes, professors were naming the best political philosopher of law in our times. Of course, he mentioned Ratz and many others. And so my student said, "Okay, what about Finis?" And he said, "Who is that? Who is Finis?" John Finis. I'm talking about London. I'm talking about Great Britain. What is my point? That memory you are mentioning is gone, even in some Catholic universities. In Latin America, is a catastrophe. So my question is, what do we need to do in order to recover the memory first, then the arguments? Mm-hmm. I think I'm concerned about that because when I go to class, they don't know what, and I'm not saying reason is, they don't know what,
right.
And so, and I'm talking about good school, quote unquote.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important concern. I guess my best answer is to try to write books about it and publish articles, which is what I'm trying to do, right? But you're right, and so I don't have my PhD, but I have my master's, and what you say is true. In my undergrad, not only did I have no exposure to Aquinas or anybody like that, I had a very thin exposure to Aristotle and Plato, and I would argue it was a largely distorted exposure. And even certain more modern philosophies like Nietzsche, we read very few of his primary texts, and instead we got like a paper on a feminist interpretation of Nietzsche, right? So it was pretty wild and unhelpful stuff overall. My master's was better because I went to a Catholic school, so there it was the exception rather than the rule, insofar as we did spend an enormous amount of time with the primary text of critical thinkers. But I understand that is the exception rather than, and because I actively sought it out at that time, right? So you're right. It's a problem. Most people are just completely ignorant of this wonderful and rich tradition, so much so that when you read so much of modern philosophy of religion or arguments for or against the existence of God, even very smart thinkers and smart critics, I think of somebody like J.L. Mackie, right? They either completely miss or totally misrepresent, right, what I think is the strongest case for classical theism, coming out of that great perennial philosophy, which I include Aquinas, but really also includes Plato and Aristotle. I think of it as like a Big Ten Platonism. So yeah, I think so much of what's going on both at the popular and academic level is enormously isolated, and suffers from a great historical ignorance. What's the solution to that? I have no idea. I try to do a podcast and I try to write books and push articles through to say, hey, when I just had an article that was accepted by the Review of Metaphysics, where it was the thesis is metaphysical grounding an instance of essentially ordered causation. So I'm trying to do exactly what you're talking about, Mario. I'm saying, hey, look, there's something going on in the contemporary literature that seems really familiar to a very traditional understanding of causation. And for whatever reason, usually historical ignorance, people haven't really connected these dots. So let me try and connect these dots for you and show that there's stuff in the tradition that can really inform a very lively contemporary debate about grounding, and not just grounding, but fundamentality, whether there's an actual fundamental layer to reality, so to speak. And my answer is yes. If we go back to thinkers like Aquinas and Scotus, they already wrestled with these ideas and they had good answers to them. The problem is most people just have no idea, right? So that's I don't think I have a better solution. I think we just have to get into the fray and try and do the best we can to connect some of these dots and say, hey, look, these because people were old doesn't mean they were stupid, right? There's also this sort of chronological condescension that goes on. I had it myself, for the longest time when I was trying to figure out my philosophical worldview. I just thought, if somebody's a couple decades out, they're probably ignorant, right? They probably don't know what they're talking about. And that was really just me being ignorant, right? And it's something I've still tried to, cast off and try and get away from that, because I've been most enriched by the oldest and more traditional thinkers. That's probably not a super satisfying response, Mario, but it's the best answer I currently have.
Well, let me just say that I prefer a more ironic and nuanced response. And I begin by reminding people of the words of John Stuart Mill. He said, after all, that no philosophy can survive if conjoined with universal idiocy.
I'm going to jump in too, because I feel like another thing.
Because you don't want to hear any more of that stuff. Go ahead, Valerie, please do.
So another thing that I think has really fallen by the wayside is just a really solid grasp of reasoning and logic. So, and we know that really starts with defining terms and making sure that we mean the same thing when we use words. So for starters, when does reason constitute an argument? So reason and argument. And when does an argument constitute a proof? A reason, argument, proof. Can you help us to define some terms?
Yeah, this is really good, and I'll try to answer this in the way that I present different arguments or reasons for the existence of God in my book. Right. So when we talk about a proof, that itself can mean many different things to many people. Some people might think something along the lines of a mathematical proof, right, where we're supposed to get a certain absolute logical certitude, right? That's a very strong claim if you say that you have a philosophical proof of that order. I think you can get philosophical proofs of that order, but they're kind of rare, right? A bit more modest would be the type of proof that we think goes on in a courtroom, something that is really well established by the preponderance of evidence, something like that. I think that's the kind of proof that's kind of we operate according to in everyday life, sort of common sense sort of proof. And then there's something somewhere in between those two, right? And this might be your traditional metaphysical proof or something like that. And the idea here, this is a traditional line of thought. Aquinas thought you had various metaphysical proofs for the existence of God. And the idea here is that we're starting from some feature or aspect of reality that is accessible to everyone. You don't need any special scientific knowledge or equipment to get access to this. And it's more or less undeniable, right? So it might be something like, hey, change occurs, or some things are contingent, or some things are made of parts, right? Something that is delivered to us through common sense. And if you start to deny it, you've got to really alter or deny some very fundamental intuitions that you have about reality. You kind of wind up in some really wacky places, right? Now, look, the reason I don't think that that's a proof of the highest order is because some philosophers do deny these things, right? They deny the reality of change or something like that. So that's a consideration. I think you wind up in various absurdities if you do that, but this is the traditional approach, right? Latch onto some feature of reality that pretty much everybody in their common mode of existence happily affirms. They don't even think to question it, right? And then you run a conceptual analysis on it, and through a series of premises, deductively structured, you get God, right? So the idea is valid logic, starting from a premise that no sane person coherently denies. We can run a conceptual analysis through a deductive chain of reasoning to get to the God of classical theism. Very ambitious form of argumentation. And, maybe it's not the proof of the highest order. The idea has always been that we can have a sort of metaphysical certitude of the existence of God. And people might think that Aquinas' de ente argument has this sort of structure. His 5 ways has this sort of structure. Aristotle's arguments, stuff like Plotinus's arguments, right? Very traditional. I develop one of these arguments in my book. I give a sort of contemporary synthetic Thomistic cosmological argument where I focus on the data, 2 points of common experience, contingency and compositeness, and I try and run that chain of reasoning to classical theism. On the other hand, what you see now, I think a little bit more prevalently in philosophy of religion, is this idea of worldview comparison. And the idea here is now it's a little bit more like the courtroom style of proof, right? Where we have 2 or maybe more competing hypotheses. So somebody comes in with their hypothesis of classical theism and they kind of articulate what that hypothesis is. Some other guy or gal comes in with their hypothesis of naturalism and they articulate what that hypothesis is. Then they try to, gather evidence for each of their respective hypotheses, right? And can you get a proof here? I think you could if you have the idea of proof, sort of like the preponderance of evidence. So this is the way my book is structured. Is I try to say, well, we can actually use both of these, and we should use both of these. This is where the new and the old approaches can actually be pretty friendly. So I start with a more traditional metaphysical proof. I think it's successful, but I also say even if you hop off, this chain of reasoning at any given point, and I give reasons why I think it would be unreasonable to do so. But say you do that, this approach at least gives us a well-formed hypothesis. It gives us a lot of conceptual clarity about what the classical theistic worldview is. And then we can carry that hypothesis into this sort of worldview comparison game. And let's be frank, a lot of it is a game. And we can test it against, say, a mainstream version of naturalism. And then we can go out and we can gather, I think, an enormous preponderance of evidence that favors classical theism, that we should be able to render a verdict that this is definitely the correct worldview from the preponderance of evidence when compared to naturalism. And I consider data not just contingency, but stability, order, fine-tuning, the moral dimension, the conscious dimension, rationality, and even suffering and evil as a sort of gathering of evidence to confirm the classical theistic worldview. So I don't know if that even remotely answers your question, but that's how I start to engage with because you're right. If somebody will throw the word proof out or something like that, and people have often wildly different ideas of what exactly constitutes a proof, but those are the 2 approaches that I typically like to take, and I think can be pretty fruitful.
Let me propose. Go ahead, Valerie. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say whatever you did originally to help with the echo seemed to have helped. So I don't know if there's a way to return to whatever you were doing when we tried to fix it the first time, but I am hearing it quite a bit.
Yeah. I think everyone was just muted when any one person was talking. Yeah. Okay. There we go. Now it's gone again.
Okay. So I wanted to just clarify. So you've got kind of common sense, or another word for that I think I've heard is axiom, right? Like an axiom is sort of this common sense universally. No? How does axiom fall into this?
I think of it as a sort of fundamental starting point, right? Yeah, that's right. So whether we're thinking of moral axioms or mathematical axioms, right? This is from which we're launching everything else. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think most people do take it as axiomatic that change is real. Some things are made of parts. Some things exist, but don't have to exist. They're contingent. Now, again, other people will deny that. And if they do, then you have to go down a layer and start to defend what I think are otherwise extremely reasonable assumptions, but that sometimes that's the best way to, I think that is the best way to escape the theistic arguments. If you want to be a skeptic, you got to go right to the root. Because I think once you kind of assume those starting points, the chain of reasoning is really powerful to classical theism. So I've come to maintain for some time at this point, Val, that the options, I don't think, from a worldview perspective, are really some sort of classical theism and a really robust scientific naturalism. I think it's classical theism or absurdism or radical skepticism. Mm-hmm. I think these are really just your table of options when it comes down to it. Mm-hmm.
And so where does an experience of the presence of God, like a personal experience of the presence of God, serve as an argument for God's existence, or can it?
Yeah, that's good. I think that type of argument, which I do not develop in my book, because some people find arguments from experience to be exceptionally weak. I don't think that they're weak when properly situated. So I think an argument for the experience of God, or a religious experience or mystical experience, can serve as a source of justification unless you have some strong reason to doubt it. Like, for example, that your friend put some weird mushrooms on your pizza or something like that, right? There's a lot of things that we take on basic experience, intuition, common sense, and we think that so long as our faculties are sort of functioning properly and they're operating in the environment that they're designed to be operating in, and they're generally oriented towards truth, then we think that things that sort of come through common experience or have a strong seem to be the case about them, we are rational and warranted in going along with it, that it actually is the case unless we have some strong reason to doubt it. But I think that type of argument is really better positioned as a sort of personal warrant or justification. I wouldn't expect it to convince the skeptic, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Mm-hmm.
Linked with religious experience, oftentimes, is the position that everyone has basic beliefs, and there are properly basic beliefs. And given one's religious experience, one might have as a properly basic belief, God exists. And this line of thought is oftentimes associated with something called Reformed epistemology. And I grew up in the very shadows of Calvin College. In the very shadows of Calvin College, which meant in the presence of Alvin Plantinga.
Yes, of course, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I wonder if you might say a few words about that. I think you already said the most important thing.
Yeah, I essentially delineated his theory of knowledge, right? Yeah,
which is that's fine if that's your properly basic belief, but it's not mine.
Yeah.
So, you've got any arguments for me to consider? I'm happy to need an argument, but I do need an argument.
Yeah, so Plantinga, and I'm a fan of a lot of Plantinga's work, and he's got a very sophisticated, really epistemology, right? So you for people who are interested, start with warrant and proper function, and then go through warranted Christian belief. But his argument is essentially that you don't need arguments to be rationally justified, believing not just in God, but he extends it to all the basic truths of the gospel, whatever those are. So the idea is something like this. It's subtle, and it's important to get it right, because a lot of people don't. But the idea is, when it comes to warrant, and warrant is whatever that quality that is needed to raise justified true belief to actual knowledge, right? That we acquire warrant when certain conditions are met. So Plantinga outlines various conditions that we need to actually have knowledge. One is that we have properly functioning cognitive faculties, operating in an environment which they are supposed to be operating in, that are operating according to a good design plan that is generally oriented at truth, and also pretty good at getting it, right? That's Plantinga's kind of theory in a nutshell. And the idea is, if that's the case, then there's a lot of things that we find ourselves just occasioned to believe, not on the basis of inferences or making arguments, but just in a very basic way, right? I sort of I'm talking to all of you. I sort of formed a belief that you're actually there, that there's a world beyond my head, that this is an hallucination. And not only that, I also formed the belief that you're all minded like me. You're not philosophical zombies or something like that. It's not something I'm arguing up to. It's not something I'm inferring. These are just beliefs that are just sort of automatically occasioned in me in the circumstances, right? And Plantinga wants to say all that can count as knowledge, right? Why? Because they are the result of properly functioning faculties that meet all these conditions, and you have no defeater. There's no reason to think otherwise, right? So you're warranted, you're rational in believing those things. You don't need any arguments for it, right? You're totally good to go. I think there's actually a lot to be said about that. In favor of it. I think it's actually a pretty good model that solves a host of issues. And I think it's very much, even though Plantinga himself was a Protestant, a number of friends of mine have extended this to the Catholic world. Dr. Tyler McNabb is a good friend of mine who's a sort of reformed epistemologist who's shown that it's quite compatible with tradition and authority, and it might even fit better in that worldview or perspective, if you will. But relevant to our conversation right here is it seems like God could easily fit as one of these properly basic beliefs, not only because we have great empirical evidence that a lot of people just sort of have this belief in God just naturally occasioned in them. They're not making inferences. We sort of, from the best that we can tell from childhood psychology, kids just have this sort of natural basic belief in a teleologically ordered world, if you will, right? This isn't something that they're indoctrinated into. In fact, it seems to be something that they have to be indoctrinated out of, which unfortunately many people are. So Plantinga just wants to extend this model to theistic belief in the more modest form. But then, of course, he, I guess, becomes increasingly more aggressive or bold about it and wants to extend it all the way through to having warrant for all of Christian belief, the basic truths of the gospel, if you will. And his project's really aiming to serve people in the sense that, hey, you can be totally rational, not just in your theistic beliefs, but your Christian beliefs, even if you don't have any arguments for it. That's sort of what Plantinga is up to. But you do need
you don't have to keep track of the latest journal articles against the existence of God.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's totally right. And right, his model is like quite resistant in the sense that, like, look, even if you don't know how to answer certain objections or arguments against it, you can simply warrant it in the sense that, like, look, you could be in a courtroom, right? And like, you know, you're innocent. You know, you didn't kill that person, but like, there's a lot of evidence that kind of like points against your position or belief. But like, you want to give up your basic, you know, your immediate beliefs that you're innocent because you have those memory beliefs of where you were when it happened, just because there's a quite significant pile of evidence that might point to the contrary. So there's a lot of unique, you know, contexts where this can be applied, that it's even, you can maintain a robust belief even in the face of various objections or arguments that you're not even quite sure.
Yes, a Baptist collaborator of Plantinga, George Mavrodes, like to say that there are reasons, and they're not like apples. If you have apples, you can give out the apples, but you might have reasons that you can't give out.
Right, yeah.
And in our communion of saints, I mean, it's beautiful the way God illustrates how some of the most powerful saints were the ones who were maybe perhaps least trained in the ways of reasoning and philosophy and all of this. So
Mario's looking really perplexed there. He's just gathering steam. Go for it, Mario.
I don't know how to formulate my objection, but
but you have one. You have one.
Well, I'm gonna be charitable, but I have perhaps a side question. I don't know if I can formulate well. When I was beginning to study philosophy back in the Middle Ages, I have a professor who was a very good one, was the only good one, who recommended us to read a book, who later, I think, became, I would call, classic to some extent within very narrow group of classical philosophers or scholars in the Spanish-speaking world. The title of the book was The Intellectual Option. The author was a philosopher, a Spanish philosopher, minor, but a very good. Carlos Cardona was a priest, already passed away. His argument was that, yes, we can render some argument about the existence of God, of anything, the immortality of the soul and all these things, but that is, let's say, the conclusion of something prior that we have been living as a philosopher. In other words, he said, if you have one worldview and you have another, you are a theist or you are a naturalist. Then you make an argument. The argument is just a conclusion of the previous life that you were engaging on from the beginning. In other words, the option was prior to the rational argument. And so he said, we can discuss all we want about rationalities and argument, but the whole point is where this life began and when this fellow began to choose a certain way of living that led to that argument. In other words, Descartes make an argument which was the conclusion of a life he chose long time before that. So we need to start to look at what? The historicity of this philosopher first. In other words, we can discuss all we want about reason divorced from that life. But we need to look at the background. And that was count. And he said, that place, if I can call that, when you start choosing, when you are young, and then that place is where the kerygma has to come. And so people then realize, and at the end, we'll have a tasted worldview. And so ultimately, philosophy is a question of options. I think it's close to some extent to what Plantinga sometimes suggests. But I think it's very interesting. And the good thing about that is that he applied a lot of history of philosophy or history of the philosopher, which is completely sometimes put aside by the English Anglo tradition. We don't study history of philosophy much as, well, the continental philosopher used to study. Well, they no longer study anything now, but I think that's my reflection. So, yeah, I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying, but
yeah, philosophy is a bunch of chicanery and it's all rationalization, right? That's what. And look, there's really something to that. You know, it's something I've tried to be aware of myself, and I think what you're saying is there's probably no ideal agnostic, right? An ideal agnostic, especially when it comes to these big ticket questions, right, that really bear significantly upon the type of life we live and how we order ourselves and what we prioritize and value. I don't think I was ever an ideal agnostic, but I think at various points I was pretty close, right? So even when I, was not at all religious, I could see, I think, certain attractive elements of a religious worldview from a largely secular perspective. But at the time, and I also think that I always saw quite clearly the rather haunting, nihilistic, and absurdist conclusions that I was inevitably veering towards from naturalism. You know, even when I was, kind of swimming in the naturalist paradigms, I never for a second, thought that those worldviews were capable of holding on to many of the things that I thought needed to be held onto, from the objective moral landscape to human free will and even rationality. I was always pretty persuaded, I'm only become increasingly persuaded, that there's great tension, if not outright incompatibility between a naturalistic worldview and so many of the deep intuitions we hold about ourselves and the world, including real agency, responsibility, rationality, morality, all that. What am I saying? I think that I was still always willing to just, or at least I wanted to, kind of follow the truth where it was. I remember many points in my life thinking, man, this position sucks, but I don't really see a way out of it. But then at some point I really did, this was after undergrad, I remember just kind of throwing my hands up about naturalism after just a series of frustrations and difficulties trying to work out various problems, saying, okay, I don't know what's true, but I'm ready to conclude that this isn't it, right? Now, at the time, I was living a really secular, sinful life, right? And and I wasn't, again, we're not always so transparent to ourselves either. I think we have to be honest about that. We're just not, nobody's perfectly transparent to us, and we're not even transparent to ourselves a lot of times. So I think the best we can do is just do the best we can do to say, okay, am I engaging in motivated reasoning here? What does the light of reason, what is it really revealing to me? And trying to follow it best we can, understanding our inherent psychological limitations and biases and stuff like that. And so while I think everything you said is very true, I think it explains a lot of what goes on in philosophy, including the vast amount of philosophical disagreement, especially among so-called epistemic peers. I'm not a total skeptic. I still think that good philosophy can be done. I think reason can adjudicate these big, important questions. It's hard. We have to take the human element into it. And I've kind of been on, different ends of the worldview spectrum. And I think I'm pretty aware of my own limitations and biases. But at the end of the day, even in the face of smart people that disagree, I just come back to all the reasons that I hold and say, yeah, I think this is right. I don't see any reason to go back or reverse course. That dude over there is smart. I think he's wrong. Here's why I think he's wrong. And then after you think only after you actually can argue that you think somebody's wrong, then I think the armchair psychoanalysis is useful, right? Maybe, right? Right. If you just do psychoanalysis beforehand, you're just going to kind of engage a bunch of fallacies and refuse to actually, confront anybody's actual argument. But at the same time, that is the human reality that does go on. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind about that is for ourselves when we're trying to work through these various issues. And of course, I believe, with God's providence and guidance, that if you're really open to his goodness and love and truth, you'll be able to figure it out. You'll be able to get there. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that was the right response or even relevant to what you were saying, but that's what I heard.
Mario?
Well, yeah, yes. I'm not saying that a way of life determines your thought, but conditioned in such a way that sometimes we just justify rationally what we are living. That's my point. So that when I hear a good argument that changed my view about a particular proposition, and I say, well, I was wrong in that argument, then I said, well, if that's true, and the other argument is the true one, then I need to change my life. But I don't want to because it's too hard. And so sometimes that is what happened. And so many philosophers say, well, you may be right, but if that is what the truth is, then I had to review my whole life. And that is not easy. That happened to some convert, but that I think is key. In other words, we somehow build our own ideology through these arguments, and because we human beings are very, very strange, to say the least. I don't know if reaction, but
well, here are a few thoughts.
Just two.
A couple few, not just two. A couple few. Elizabeth Anscombe has a phrase that oftentimes comes to mind. She refers to the endless twistiness of the human mind. The endless twistiness of the human mind, and that's certainly the case. And the fall has made the twistiness exceedingly twisty. But there are a couple of other phrases that come to mind. We as Christians believe that we should announce the good news to everyone. And we believe that everyone, another phrase this time in Latin, is capax Dei. Everyone has the capacity for God. However labyrinthian their lives have been, they nonetheless retain the capacity for God. And when St. Thomas Aquinas, the common doctor, talks about being made in the image and likeness of God, he cites John of Damascus, who, interestingly enough, grew up in a Muslim context. That John of Damascus says that to be made in the image and likeness of God is first and foremost to be free and rational. And I don't think we want to say, as Christians, and I don't know, I think this is not so much arguing in a circle as that there's a interconnection between things. I don't think we want to say of an atheist with whom we are in dialogue that he or she is not free and rational. He or she might say, I'm neither free nor rational, but to teach the gospel, to preach the gospel, to announce the good news is to assume that everyone is Capax Dei. And I think if we're Capax Dei, we're able to think reasonably about God. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be able to write a book called The Best Argument for God, but we're certainly able to read that book, right, Patrick?
I think so. I wanted to make it at least generally accessible. I get into some metaphysical tall grass here and there, but my aim with this book was to bring forth what I think were some of the best insights in the tradition and marry them with, I think, actually not everything new is terrible, with some of the best advancements in contemporary philosophy, but also bring it down to the non-philosopher, so to speak, assuming that they're at least seriously interested in the material. It's a challenging read, but I think it's good to engage stuff that challenges you, and as long as it also gives you the help that you need to get through it, right? So that was actually one of the hardest parts of writing the book, was just trying to hit that balance. So whether I succeeded will be determined by the Amazon reviews, I suspect.
Oh no, don't ever say that.
I set myself up for failure. Sure.
There are certain people that sneak in there.
Mm-hmm.
Valerie, would you say it was a readable book?
Oh, I wish I would have had time to read through it all, but I'm looking forward to. I did kind of skim it, and I'm looking forward to it. I've been having providentially some interesting conversations with my beloved cousin lately, who's more of a naturalist. And in my own conversion after college, after 18 years of Catholic schooling, at the time I wouldn't have called it naturalism, but I sometimes say I went from living in 2D to 3D, or it would probably be better to say from a 3D existence to a 4D existence. This idea that kind of the here and the now and the material world was in my consciousness, that was my horizon. There was not this transcendent sense, even though I had ideas of that and I didn't reject it. I just didn't live in that realm consciously. So can you just define naturalism and then maybe in contrast classical theism, since you're working with those concepts?
Yeah, really important. Like you said, we should get clear on our terms. And I spend a lot of time, probably too much time. It's a bit tedious at the beginning of the book, trying to gain as much clarity as possible. One of the difficulties with the contemporary debate is talk to 5 different naturalists. You'll get 5 ideas of what naturalism is supposed to be about. So what I do is I try to, grab the most mainstream understanding as represented by the best naturalist thinkers and go from there. And then I say, hey, look, if you've got a completely different idea of naturalism, then I guess I'll have to write a follow-up book. And that's the best I can do, right? So naturalism is obviously committed to the idea that nature is all there is, right? Now, that's not super helpful from the start, because it's like, well, what counts as nature, right? And on some understandings of nature of naturalists, I sometimes think, well, that could include the existence of God, right? You're not restricted enough, right? But generally, naturalists will stipulate that there are only natural things and natural causes, right? Roughly the stuff science tells us about, science-y stuff, right? There's nothing supernatural, nothing completely unbounded. Not just God, but you'll find among naturalists say no fairies either. For whatever reason, they've got this thing against fairies. And naturalism is frequently committed to what's called source physicalism. And the idea there is that the physical realm precedes, often quite significantly, and causes and determines the mental realm. So whatever mind is, it is something of a late and local phenomena, right? It's not fundamental to reality in any sense, right? Something that's emergent very later on. So naturalism is really just like atomic theory plus evolutionary theory is the kind of way to summarize it in a cartoon way. Its epistemology is scientistic, meaning that what we know should really, in a broad sense, should just be kind of what comes through the hypothetico-deductive method. Anything beyond that is either meaningless, we can't know it at all, or it's like a far inferior source of knowledge and justification. For the naturalist anyways. So that's the kind of painting with a broad brush of what naturalism is about. Classical theism is committed to the idea, sometimes the way I describe it in the book is naturalism is committed to this idea of the principle of indifference. This is how one naturalist frames it, that whatever fundamental reality is, it's utterly indifferent. It's not minded, it's not intentional, it's not aiming towards anything, it's not malevolent, it's not benevolent, it's just totally indifferent, right? Classical theism, I argue, is sort of rooted in the principle of perfection. At the bottom of reality is this completely unbounded entity, unbounded in its power, in its knowledge, in its goodness. It possesses only all purely positive features or properties. These are features or properties that don't inherently entail a limit, like power and knowledge and goodness, right? Eternal, immutable. Sometimes it's captured with simple descriptions like absolute supremacy or absolute perfection or maximal greatness. Different philosophers come out about it different ways. And from that one single source principle of perfection, which is God, flows the rest of the created order, the natural order, which is just a bunch of stuff that is bounded. So you have bounded stuff coming from the unbounded. For the naturalist, everything is bounded. Everything is finite in a sense and undirected. So doesn't, we could fine tune those more, but I think that's enough to get a general understanding of the different paradigms.
Very helpful. Thank you.
For sure.
Mario, another question. We're getting too close to the end, and I don't want you to zip out without another question. And I've got one question too, but I don't have to ask mine.
No, you can ask the question. Then I can follow up. You are in charge.
A major Christian philosopher who recently died is Marilyn McCord Adams. And in her most recent work, she said we have to look not just at the problem of evil, but at the problem of horrific evil.
Yeah, horrendous evil, right. Mm-hmm.
What are we to say about that? What are we to say, for example, about all of the people who have died painful deaths while being abandoned over the course of history?
Yeah, so what do I have, like 6 minutes to address the most serious objection to the theism? I say that.
When I give a paper, I always raise such an objection. Unfortunately, time doesn't allow me to deal with it.
Thanks for the softball right at the end. So let me say, look, the problem of evil is it's serious. It's something I take very seriously. We all wrestle with it, right? We all wrestle seriously with the problem of evil on different levels, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. So just understand that whatever I'm going to say in the final 6 minutes here is totally inadequate, and just give me the promissory note that I have a huge section about this in the book if you want to go.
Plus, we don't have anybody scheduled for 2 weeks from today.
Yeah, fine. We can.
Hey, dude, this is just the prologue. Go for it.
Yeah. So let me frame it. Philosophers are interested in the intellectual side of the problem of evil. Is there something about? Usually, it's a focus on suffering. Right, I think this is the most relevant aspect of the problem of evil. Is there something about this distribution of suffering that is either strictly incompatible with the notion of God? This would be a strong form logical problem of evil, or that counts as significant evidence against the existence of God, right? So do we have a demonstration from evil against God, or do we have an evidential case where maybe God exists, but this just seems to make it a lot less likely? And these are often divided into the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil in the literature. I'll give the abbreviated version that the logical problem of evil has largely, but not entirely, been kind of tossed into the philosophical dustbin. In fact, Alvin Plantinga took a number of significant blows against this because what he has shown, but many philosophers before him, James Ross, another significant one who I don't think gets enough credit as a Catholic philosopher, of showing that there is a linking principle that's needed for the atheist or skeptic to show that the evil of this world is incompatible with the God of classical theism. What is that linking principle? It's something that has to do with divine justification or something like that. There cannot be any that we know that God can't possibly have morally sufficient reasons for permitting this particular distribution of suffering. And the point is this is where the theist can play the skeptic, and many do. They say the atheist has come nowhere close to establishing the truth of that sort of unspoken premise or assumption, right? And there's many different schools that take that approach, more or less skeptical theist schools or stuff like that. And I think it's actually effective. The burden of the proof really is on the skeptic here to kind of be omniscient and survey the space of reasons that could be encompassed by the divine intellect and systematically rule them out. And how could anybody do that? The answer is nobody. Nobody could possibly do that, right?
And Job didn't try.
Job tried, right? So the focus instead has largely been shifted, and because many atheists concede, that's right. That's right. The logical problem of evil does seem to be a structural failure, right? And I think that's an important thing to note. You know, philosophy doesn't always make advancements, but it seems like there's actually been something of an advancement in the philosophical discourse over the past couple decades towards the evidential problem of evil. And here you have different representatives of the skeptics. You have Rowe and you have Draper. But generally, the idea here is, hey, naturalism just has a better explanation for the suffering of this world than theism does. Take the principle of indifference, throw in evolutionary theory. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Not so surprising, right? But theism, you've got this perfect foundation and you have all this awful stuff that happens, kind of surprising, right? So that's the idea of the evidential game. Is it surprising on this paradigm? Is it not surprising on that paradigm? Then it counts as evidence for the paradigm, which it is, less surprising. Pretty common sense reasoning, right? Let me give a survey of ways that this can be, I think, effectively handled. One is, this is from Brian Davis. He just calls it, we know that God exists approach, right? And the idea here is, okay, that might all well be true, but here's the deal. We have other arguments for the existence of God, and they're demonstrative. I just gave you Aquinas' 5 ways. I just gave you the Dante, and I showed you that none of this stuff could exist, the entire contingent realm, unless God exists. So we know that God exists. We know that suffering and evil definitely occur, but if two things are actual, they must be compatible. I don't see how they're compatible, but they must be. So at worst, it's a mystery, not a problem, right? And maybe we need to turn to revelation for a complete solution. I think that approach is perfectly legitimate. It actually has a lot of pull with me, but I don't think it's going to convince your hardened skeptic or something like that. But it's definitely,
seriously. 2 weeks from today, you have to come back and continue this theme and explore it fully.
All right, yeah.
Fortunately, and I'm serious about that. 2 weeks from today, and I'll get back to you via email. We have 1 minute left, and we always end with the gospel for the day. So I'm going to end on this note.
Good.
This is from Luke. As Jesus and his disciples were proceeding on their journey, someone said to him, "I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus answered him, "Foxes have dens and birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to rest his head." And to another he said, "Follow me." But he replied, "Lord, let me go first and bury my father." But he answered him, "Let the dead bury their dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." And another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me say farewell to my family at home." Jesus answered him, "No one who sets a hand to the plow and looks to what was left behind is fit for the kingdom of God. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much.
Thank all of you very much.
I'll email you ASAP.
Well, thank you very much. I would love to continue the conversation because we just opened the thread on a very important topic. So let's keep it going.
That's the way philosophy is. Once you get going, you can't stop. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was really, really great stuff, and I look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you, Valerie. A lot of fun. We'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.